Hello and welcome to Heroes and Humans of Football. My name is Mehreen Khan.
And I'm Simon Cooper. This is the football show where we take the hero and we show you the human.
From Johan Cruyff to Megan Rapinoe.
And from George Best to Kylian Mbappe.
This is the Human Football Podcast.
Last week's episode was on Sepp Blatter, president of FIFA for 17 years. I sat down with him and we talked, and I asked him every question I ever wanted to ask. We asked in this episode, is he unfairly maligned or just as bad as everyone says? If you haven't already, go back and have a listen. Well, hello and welcome to Heroes and Humans. Today we're talking about the Scotsman who survived 27 years at Manchester United, came to embody England's biggest club, and then watched it collapse after he left. He's the manager who dumped David Beckham. He was the angriest man in football who turned what looked like an unhinged personality into a management philosophy. So how did Alex Ferguson go from working class, trade union Glasgow, to being the winningest club manager in football history? And are there any leadership lessons at all in how he did it? Ferguson probably deserves a whole season of Heroes and Humans. We are giving him a double header. And this episode, part one, is about the making of. What's your initial take or supposition?
Well, I think we got to go big with this, right? So my initial starting point is to ask the question whether Sir Alex Ferguson is the most successful British leader in the post-war era, full stop.
And you mean all fields combined?
All fields. Politics, as we'll get onto, sport, of course, finance, all of the industries in which we think management and leadership play real roles in shaping success.
And many people in those fields sort of hung at his lips and begged him for lessons.
Exactly, because his methods, his character, his leadership style are poured over by the world's elites, let's put them that way, right? So all of these things have meant that Fergie has had, bizarrely enough, very prestigious teaching berths at Harvard Business School, where the world's budding elites hang on his every word.
Or if they can understand the accent.
That's true. I mean, the Ferguson magic has also become an obsession with some of the titans of finance, one of whom we'll talk about a bit later on, Michael Moritz, a billionaire who's invested in Apple and YouTube and co-wrote a book with Ferguson about leadership. And he's the envy of our political leaders and probably has been for a long time, longer than I've been alive. Most of our political leaders today can barely scrape one or two electoral terms. And Ferguson has been doing this for at least 30 years.
Yeah, he was at the top of football from the early 80s until 2013 when he goes out on another massive high. Yeah.
And in that period, so let's say for me, from the mid-90s onwards, he's the most domineering figure in football. He is omnipotent, omnipresent. Everything around British football, and will come to be European football, revolves around what Sir Ferguson does, how he assembles his team, how he beats rivals, how he sometimes falls foul of them. And even now, I find it quite weird to think that we live in a post-Fergie era, because Fergie is such a reference point. Not even just for Manchester United fans, of which I'm not.
Yeah, I mean, I wrote about football for many of those years from 1986 when he joins Man U and I start writing freelance football journalism as a 16-year-old until 2013 when he leaves, just after I've stopped being a full-time football writer. So, yeah, he's always there, front of stage, but he wasn't the national treasure that he is now in his 80s when sort of almost everybody thinks he's this wizard-like figure and sweet. He was hated. And it took me a long time to realize what a genius he was. So to my shame, in the first edition of our book, Soccernomics, I say, look, Manchester United's success is just that because they're the richest club is going to win stuff. And if I manage Manchester United, I'd probably do as well as Ferguson has, which is one of the stupidest things I've ever written, which is quite a high bar to set.
Indeed.
We cut it out of later editions, and I'm deeply ashamed of that because over time, I came to understand better just how he had created this empire of daily excellence. I was wrong, and now I feel I have a better sense of his greatness. So apologies.
when he's at the top, he's, divisive is the cliche that is used about Ferguson. But I'm struck by it very quickly as soon as even in his last couple of seasons, the posterity changes, right? So the way that he's seen is it immediately goes from divisive to actually we'll never see a great of this generation again. And I think, as we'll speak about, that's because of circumstances of his birth, the fact that he is a post-war baby, he's lived in certain conditions and suffered certain hardships, which we just can't point to anymore in a new generation of managers, where managers are getting younger and younger and younger. And a bit like our politicians, the first thing they go into, their main professional job is getting coaching practice and becoming football people. They've never really done anything else.
Yeah, and also because he grows up in a small country with a relatively small football economy, Scotland, he has to work outside football.
Yeah, he's got that hinterland, which I think makes him incredible. Looking back, we are all very nostalgic about it, but maybe some of that nostalgia is misplaced.
I mean, he was a deeply ungracious and often unfair and manipulative.
Yeah, and violent and cruel.
He would just not be allowed today. But still,
the idea of kids at Harvard Business School being like, "Oh, we need to learn from Fergie," I think there's something deeply.
He said, "Go and punch your subordinates in the face."
Yeah. Fire everyone. So I guess the bigger question is there anything, as you said, that we can actually learn from this guy, or is he just a complete one-off?
Is Fergusonism just not replicable by anyone else anywhere else?
So in these 2 episodes, we'll discuss what makes Ferguson the envy of some of the world's richest and most powerful people, and I think we can say the greatest British coach of all time.
That's damning with faint praise. Why don't you start us off with some stats?
Yes. Alex Ferguson, as he was known to his parents and his family, was born in Glasgow on December 31, 1941, which was the same month as Pearl Harbor. Even you were not around then, Simon. He played football, had a respectable career as a forward, and won 4 caps for Scotland, some of which were kind of half caps, but
don't say that, he will come after you.
The historical record meant that he was given, they were designated as full caps later on.
Decades later, they were given full cap status, yeah.
As a young manager, Alex Ferguson managed East Stirlingshire and St Mirren, 2 minnows in Scottish football. And then at Aberdeen, he broke the Celtic Rangers Old Firm duopoly by winning an unprecedented 3 Scottish titles from 1980 to 1985.
Unprecedented for a non-Old Firm club.
Non-Glasgow club. This was capped off by the real jewel in his Scottish domestic career, which was winning the European Cup Winners' Cup in 1983 by beating the mighty Real Madrid. Yes, Real Madrid versus Aberdeen, and Aberdeen come out on top. Ferguson moves to Manchester United in 1986 and wins absolutely nothing in his first seasons until he has a breakthrough with the FA Cup in 1990. Ferguson's glory years are from 1993 through to 2013, where he wins an incredible 13 Premier League titles and 2 Champions League trophies. The zenith, of course, was that incredible treble in 1999. He retires in 2013, aged 71, with 38 major trophies at United. In total, he won 49 trophies as a manager, which is still an international record. But of course, a certain Pep Guardiola is coming straight for him and is currently at 37.
Yeah, it sounds like a lot fewer than 49, but at the rate Pep is going, give it about 2 or 3 years.
Pep's on about 5 a season these days, if we're going to count cup winners, blah, blah cups as well. Simon, we often have a pronunciation section when we have slightly more exotic guests, but you're going to get on your little soapbox about what we refer to our protagonist in this episode.
We're not going to call him Sir Alex because knighthoods are ridiculous and usually just a mark of being a crony of the ruling party.
Until you get one.
I should have had one, and it will undoubtedly come one day. I check the post every morning.
Yeah.
We don't respect the title. We do respect the man. I am not his mate, so I am not going to call him Fergie. To me, he is Ferguson. What are you calling him?
I don't mind calling him Fergie because if you have at least 3 syllables in your surname, you should expect it to be shortened.
Well, that's why you have a surname with 1 syllable.
Indeed, my parents were clever. Yeah. But as we'll refer to in future episodes, like in Pochettino, I'm going to call him Poch. I'm sorry.
Okay, fair enough.
It's not a matey thing. It's just for efficiency's sake.
Yeah, and on Heroes and Humans, we always call Pep. So yeah.
Okay, you've decided what you're going to call him, Simon. So why don't you tell us a little bit about his early life, the real makings of Alex Ferguson?
Obviously, I've followed him as a football journalist, but to get his early life, I have lent on the enormous library of Fergusoniana, which is this whole subgenre of sports writing. So you have great writing by people like Jim White, Patrick Barclay, Matt Dickinson, Hugh McIlvenney, who became Ferguson's ghostwriter. And then for his own 1999 autobiography, Ferguson handed McIlvenney 200,000 words of notes, which he'd written on lots of different sheets of paper. Wow. And so he essentially wrote 2 books full on just pieces of paper. Which
so a lot of this is straight from the horse's mouth.
Yeah, it's from the horse's mouth. Yeah. So who is this man? And I think the key in his own mind is Govan. That's where he comes from. In his office at United, he had a sign on the wall saying, "I come for Govan."
Where the hell is Govan?
Well, Govan, which I think is how you pronounce it, is central to understanding Ferguson because it's this dockside neighbourhood in Glasgow. It's quite near Ibrox Park where Rangers play. So he grows up, less than a mile from the Rangers Stadium. There's going to be a lot of shout-outs to Rangers, not all of them positive. And Govan had been a fishing village before industrialisation, and it still had its own identity. It still felt it was a separate place from Glasgow. And Glasgow, where Ferguson is growing up, is the city in the world where football is taken most seriously. Glasgow has 3 massive stadiums, Ibrox, Celtic Park, and Hampden, the international stadiums, if they needed a whole separate international stadium. And those days particularly dominated by religious questions, Scottish football. So Rangers are very much still then the Protestant club and Celtic the Catholic club. And he will run into issues around this because he is the son of a Catholic mother and a Protestant father, because the Fergusons were nobody tells us who to marry. And he himself would later marry a Catholic. So he's born in a mixed marriage, but he's raised as a Protestant because his dad says, rightly, there are more opportunities for Protestants because the anti-Catholic bigotry is so strong and most people at the top of Glasgow business and industry are Protestants.
So it's a strategic decision.
Strategic decision. So his mother, a Catholic, sends him to the Protestant church, but they're not very religious people. What they really believe in is socialism. It's a very working class family. They live in a tenement. His dad is a shipbuilder at the time, and they're not the poorest family at all. They do have an indoor toilet, which, is a mark of
luxury.
Some working class status. They don't have a bathroom. Bathtubs kept under the bed, you bathe on Friday evenings. But he said they never felt poor because everyone was the same. He said it's not like there were people driving around Govan in Rolls Royces. His mum and dad slept in the kitchen, but he told the BBC his dad had a wee loft at the top of his bed where the dad kept his books because the dad worked in the shipyards, but he was also an obsessive reader. So these are very serious people. They're about bettering themselves, but also bettering their class, the working class.
And Ferguson is, we've said this of many other people, but he's definitely a patron saint of this podcast because he'll go on to say that you can really only understand people by knowing where they're from and who they come from. So one of his classic tropes is to always ask his players what their fathers and their grandfathers did. Because ultimately he realises that even if you have slightly privileged or middle class footballers, if you go back enough generations, there is a working class origin to every footballer.
Yeah, and usually the working class origin is direct. Most of the players he deals with in his career, their parents are working class. And he says, you want your parents to be proud of you. And his idea of working class is working.
Yeah.
So it's about fanatical work ethic. His dad getting out of bed every morning at 6, doing enormous days at the shipyards. And that to him is what you should honour as a Manchester United player
your
later.
Lineage and also your inheritance as somebody who comes from working class in the literal sense of that, what that means.
He really takes pride in being from the Govan, the Glasgow working class, and he keeps the accent, which becomes very confusing when he later goes to England and he manages this multinational team where you want to communicate in Globish. So most Premier League teams operate in Globish, which is a kind of small vocabulary, not much slang, very clear.
Yeah.
You give me that cup, yes? Globish is much easier for most foreigners to understand than English. But Ferguson doesn't even really speak English. He speaks this Glaswegian dialect in a very strong accent, and he has a slight speech defect. So instead of bloody, he says waddy.
Does he?
Yeah. This is identified, I think, by Patrick Barclay, journalist and fellow Scot. So he's very, very hard to understand. In fact, when I asked Jaap Stam, who came from Holland, spoke Globish, encounters Ferguson at Manchester United, I said, what did you think of him? And Stam said, hard to understand.
That was the first thing he said.
Yeah. So Ferguson, when he acquires this country mansion outside Manchester, he calls it Fairfields, which is the shipyard where his father worked for 3 decades. And he calls his first racehorse Queensland Star after a ship that his dad helped build there. He feels emotionally he never left Govan. So you have socialism and then you have football. And these are the two sort of creeds he grows up in. And football is everything. And in those days, when he's growing up in the 50s, Scottish football, you have this idea of the wee tanner ball player. It's a passing game. It's sort of Guardiolan style football compared to the English kick and rush. It's very sophisticated. It's taken immensely seriously. So the boys' club, Drumchapel, where he grows up, also will later produce Kenny Dalglish and then David Moyes. And in fact, the young Ferguson is managed by Moyes' father. So this is a world where the men are just obsessive about football.
And it's a more sophisticated form of football than you'll see in England.
Yeah, and I think that idea of the passing game, which Ferguson himself cannot play as a footballer, we'll come to see, will be central to his ideology. So like Brian Clough just before him, Ferguson is a very rare manager in English football who actually believes in passing. He believes football is about passing, which in the 70s and 80s, nobody in English football believes.
Wow. So I think we should emphasise that. So Scotland is this kind of...
It's this kind of proto-Spain.
Yeah.
It's a kind of tiki-taka football by the standards of British football of the day. Yeah.
So it's not a surprise that some of the greatest managers and very iconic players of the era will be Scottish.
Well, we'll come to the great Scottish managerial tradition, which Ferguson is very conscious of, because there are way more great Scottish managers in sort of the late 20th century than there are great English managers.
So we have football and we have socialism, but we also have the realities of living in a post-war industrial city, which are often very violent and gruesome. And Ferguson has also spoken about the day-to-day realities of growing up in Govan.
I mean, it's a place of extraordinary violence. He doesn't seem to think that's a bad thing. He thinks it's a masculine quality that you should have. You should be capable of extraordinary violence. And so you read the autobiography, Managing My Life, and the chapters on the youth, it's like a Quentin Tarantino movie. Always, there's this constant violence. So Ferguson, as a boy, he has to beat up the bullies of his cousin who has polio. When he's a 19-year-old professional footballer, he's bitten by an opposing player. Now, I think biting people is probably quite normal. And I mean, he said...
yellow card.
Max. I mean, if you whined about it. But he runs a pub in the docks in 1970s Glasgow, and the pub is called Fergie's. And at one point, there's this complicated whiskey heist, and somebody ends up walking in with a shotgun. And eventually he quits the pub because he's tired of coming home at weekends with, in his words, a cut head or swollen jaw from trying to keep the peace.
It sounds like a Western.
Yeah, it's a little bit like Dodge. But I mean, imagine if Ferguson is the guy who has to keep the peace.
Yeah, almost. Yeah, exactly. That shows you, the level that he's operating at.
The downstairs bit of Fergie's he renames the elbow room because he was known as a centre forward for his use of elbows. The ideal in this world is to be a man's man. I'll put that in quotes because we know that's toxic masculinity now.
Weirdly enough, we are celebrating it in this episode, but I guess...
No, I think we should maintain a critical view because in the classic narrative about Ferguson, he's celebrated as a man's man. Yeah. And I think we need to say, look, this is not good.
Okay. Well, that's very evolved of you. Fine, I'm happy to go into that mould.
But in this world, men are always beating each other up. As a manager, he very much, even, in late middle age, he still carries that ethos around. I mean, he's not so much beating people up in his 60s and 70s, but every confrontation, whether it's with a journalist or a player or an opposing manager, is a fight waiting to happen.
And I think, maybe it's not fair to say that this was reflected in his players, but a lot of the way some of his most ferocious players behaved, you would think behaviour that I'm not say sanctioned by Ferguson, but not necessarily something that he would say, well, you've got to cut it out. I mean, Roy Keane is the first one that springs to mind. He is scary on the field when he's going after an opponent, as we spoke about in our episode about Haaland and Alfie.
Yeah, and I don't think it's a coincidence that Roy Keane becomes the leader of Ferguson's great team of the 90s, because, I mean, Ferguson is slightly discomforted by Keane, who is often on the outer edge of sanity.
He would be in the elbow room, wouldn't he? He'd be captain of the elbow room.
Elbows at the least. But you never see Ferguson coming into the press conference afterwards and saying, well, Roy deserves to have been sent off for, cutting that fellow's leg off, or I'm sorry, Roy bit him in the neck. It's never that. It's always disgrace and there's a conspiracy against us.
But we will speak about a very complicated relationship between Roy Keane and Sir Alex in part 2.
Yes, indeed, about the great years. But to foreshadow that, this Govan ideal will be carried into his Manchester United time. And so you get these stories of probably quite baffled Latin footballers like Cristiano Ronaldo, Nani and Anderson having to listen to these stories about dockyard workers.
And tool makers. They just haven't got a clue.
Yeah, but they probably couldn't hear what he was saying anyway. Now, this working class childhood in the west of Scotland, it sounds very exotic to us, but it was actually almost the norm for great British managers in the days when there were still great British managers, and Ferguson was the last great British manager to date.
Or are they all just Scottish managers?
Well, yes. So the three who would have been considered the holy trinity of British managers before him, Matt Busby, Bill Shankly, and Jock Stein. And Jock Stein is the hero of Ferguson's earlier years. Ferguson has said that the values of managers like Stein, Busby, and Bill Shankly were rooted in their mining background. And he writes, "I'm sure too that any success I've had in handling men, and especially in creating a culture of loyalty and commitment in my teams, owes much to my upbringing among the working men of Clydeside." Now, this may sound like, kind of ridiculous Hollywoodized working class nostalgia, but he actually really believes this stuff. And in his worldview, you don't rise alone and leave your community behind. You rise with your community. You are part of your community. And so at Manchester United, he will try and recreate this working class community he grew up in. So this background is just very different from anyone in football today, because this is a man who works in working class jobs outside football, like politicians who used to have real jobs.
Well, that's why we're also romanticising him, right?
Are we romanticising?
Well, in contradistinction to what we now consider to be the more modern generations of managers for whom football has always been football, and they've never had to been forced to do other jobs.
Well, I'm wary of romanticising Ferguson, because I don't think he's a good person.
Really?
Yeah. So, but I do think he's a remarkable person. So I just think we need to understand him rather than
Well, I think
love him.
there is a mythology which surrounds him, and I guess what we're pointing at is the romanticization of this element of his early life.
But not by us.
No, we are taking a cold, clinical eye over these narratives, I guess.
So he wants to be a professional footballer, but he's not very good. He's not sort of an obvious star. And so he's scraping around at the bottom of the game. And meanwhile, he apprentices for years at a firm that makes typewriters. So he's a toolmaker. Aged 18, it's 1960, he's 18, he also becomes a trade union rep, what was called a shop steward, trade union leader of this little place. And at one point, the apprentices, these young boys learning the trade of making typewriters, they all have a meeting in the gents' toilet where they agree to go out on strike. And he leads that strike. And they're not striking for higher pay or better conditions for themselves. They're striking for apprentices in another firm who are badly paid. So that's this kind of working class, community, shared responsibility.
And this sense of wanting it to stick it to the man almost as soon as he knows if there's a man to be had, he's going for them.
Yeah, and he carries on that attitude even when he is the man himself.
Indeed.
He still behaves like he's an angry rebel. So he's only in his late teens, but he's learning to lead working class men and also to read working class men, to understand them. So he has this great gift of empathy coupled with this aggression and violence. He really can see into people's souls. And he says it's also at that point, late teens, early 20s, that he learns that the most important thing you need to have as a leader is communication skills, especially when you're asking people to go out on strike.
Verbal communication skills, right?
Yes.
Because usually you think, he's a man, so he's very non-verbal, grunting, pointing,
he's exceptionally verbal.
But actually he sits down and talks to his guys.
Ferguson is an incredible communicator in words, and also, it seems, in writing.
He's an orator.
Even
if he's difficult to understand, ironically.
And he's also a writer. I think he writes a lot of letters. He dictates letters. So he's very comfortable with words. And he's also a reader like his dad. He's an obsessive reader, I think, of nonfiction. So his dad has forced him into a trade before football, so he has something to fall back on if playing doesn't work out. But in fact, those years where he has jobs outside football help him develop these superpowers of comradeship, collectivism, communication. Now, there's this famous quote from Bill Shankly, working class Scot, who becomes famous manager of Liverpool. And Shankly said, "The socialism I believe in is everyone working for each other, everyone having a share of the rewards. It's the way I see football. It's the way I see life." Actually, shall we do this in a Scottish accent?
Go on then.
We have a special guest today, which is Narrowkeet, which is an AI website that produces voices and accents, in this case, Scottish accents. As you know, Mehreen is a world-class mimic and producer of Midlands accents.
Fantastic.
What else can you do?
Australian is actually my best, but we're going to have to wait for an episode on Ange Postecoglou.
Yeah, but you're preparing your Aussie
or Harry
accent.
Kewell or Mark Viduka. Basically, we need an Australian.
Right. You're the kind of Peter Sellers of accents.
Yeah, that is the nicest thing that you've ever said about me, Simon.
But you can't do a Scottish accent. And so we have brought in narrakeets to replicate with 100% accuracy the Scottish accents, which will figure heavily in the early stages of this episode.
And just to make it sound like me, she's a woman.
Yes, we set narrakeet to the woman-speaking setting because I think that adds this little touch of alienation from these Scottish men.
So now we're going to use AI to replicate Bill Shankly's voice if Bill Shankly was Belinda Shankly.
The socialism I believe in is everyone working for each other, everyone having a share of the rewards. It's the way I see football, the way I see life.
But we're basically saying that Ferguson is not this leftist hero. And if you are a true progressive, maybe Ferguson is not really part of the clan. He kind of pays, he has a certain different idea. Maybe one could say lip service to socialism. Let's talk about his life as a player because he does make it. He has a career. And as we've spoken about before, in this period of football, you cannot have managed a football team if you can't say that you've also played the game. Simon, what kind of player was he? We've already mentioned that he was a physical striker, but what else was notable about his playing career?
Well, he was a tough goal-scoring centre-forward. He was very violent, even by the standards of Scottish football of the time. At different times, he said he was sent off in his career 6 times or 8 times. Now, imagine what you would have to do in Scottish football in,
GBH.
what is it, the 60s to be sent off. General bodily harm. Yeah, I mean, nowadays...
Grievous bodily harm.
Yeah, grievous bodily harm.
As opposed to actual bodily harm. But I love this. He says about himself, I think I was aggressive. I don't think it was emotional. But what does the emotional part refer to?
Well, emotional means, I'm really angry, so I'm going to punch him in the face. No, it was
like,
I'm going to punch him in the face because that's smart.
Because that's how I'm going to win the ball back.
And he did his, quote, homework on every centre-half he played against. And he says there were some psychopaths up there, people who would head into the back of your head. And you would also have to have great disregard for your own head to head into the back of somebody else's head.
Yeah. As a strategy, it's very, very stupid. He also told the BBC, maybe perhaps some realization that this wasn't really acceptable. He said, quote, you wouldn't call this tackling, you'd call it abuse.
He's talking about how the defenders played him. But when he meets his future wife, Kathy, he has a plaster on his face. And she thinks, well, this man is either a boxer or a gangster.
Or a rapper called Nelly.
Or a rapper. I don't think there were many rappers in 1960s Scotland. In fact, he's none of those things. He's a toolmaker who also plays for St Johnstone. Very small club. His football career is going nowhere. And for a while, he can't even get into the St Johnstone first team. And he's not really living it.
And this is quite a difficult time for him. I guess in another foreshadowing of things that he'll encounter in his managerial career, the young Fergie, the sort of frustrated, stultified Fergie, goes off the rails in a classic young man, don't know what to do with his life way. He starts drinking. On one particularly rowdy night out, he ends up punching someone in the face outside a pub and even goes to jail for it. So I think he gets put in the clink overnight.
I mean, I have to say, I think this would probably be considered fairly standard young man behaviour in Govan at the time. It's not considered going off the rails. It's just, a way of passing the time.
Yeah. Maturation into manhood. But it does upset his father, who is a sort of towering figure in his life. He falls out with his father because his father thinks he's, squandering away his life. Classic story of a young boy doesn't know what to do and a father figure who wants to discipline him and get him back onto the right path.
Yeah, I mean, he doesn't really know what to do because he's not going to be a great footballer. He doesn't want to make typewriters his whole life. So what's he going to do? What he does is what many Scots in those days are doing. He applies for papers to emigrate to Canada. So there's a Canada House in Glasgow and he goes there and, he's all getting ready to cross the ocean for a better life because Canada, in the 60s, obviously much richer than Glasgow. And so you have this incredible counterfactual in the Ferguson story. Yeah. What if he'd got the papers and he'd emigrated to Canada in the 60s?
What would he be doing in Canada? He'd be like probably the greatest ice hockey manager of all time.
I reckon he would be running either some major enterprise or he would be leading the Canada Association of Trade Unions, whatever that is.
Oh, truth.
So he's just ready to emigrate, give up professional football, and then something happens. St Johnstone are trying to call him to come out for a game. And he thinks, they're just going to make me play in the reserves again. I'm sick of that. So he tries to pretend he has flu. And he gets his brother's girlfriend to call the St Johnstone manager. The girlfriend has to pretend to be Fergie's mum. And says, Fergie can't play, he has flu.
Yeah, because obviously when men have the flu, they're literally wiped out and they can't even, talk.
We're going to replicate that phone call.
Fergie can't play. He has the flu.
But the manager, Bobby Brown, understands what he's doing. And he screams at him. He says, you got your brother's girlfriend to call me pretending to be your mum, saying you got flu. You don't have flu, but a lot of our players do actually have flu. So we don't have enough players for the first team. So even though we hate you, you got to come out and play for the first team against Rangers at Ibrox.
This is Fergie's flu game.
Yeah, his flu game. And he plays against Rangers at Ibrox. Rangers are the team he grew up supporting.
His boyhood club.
And he scores a hat-trick. It's the end of 63. He's the first player from an away team, apparently, to score a hat-trick at Rangers. And this isn't every dog has his day story.
Roy of the Rover stuff, dare I say.
Yeah, but in those days, luckily for him, football clubs do not have very sophisticated transfer policies. They don't run data. They're just like, oh, this bloke Ferguson scored a hat-trick against Rangers. So suddenly he's in demand as a footballer. He gives up on the idea of Canada and he finally goes full-time as a player, aged 22, 23 at Dunfermline. So he doesn't have to work on the side anymore.
So everything changes very quickly in terms of his entire prospects around football.
Yeah.
Amazing.
He decides, okay, I'm never going to go back to engineering toolmaking again. I'm going to do this different thing. I'm going to become a football coach. And he starts taking his coaching badges, as it was called then, studying to be a coach. Now, coaching in Scotland is considered this newfangled continental thing, like people used to talk about data in football a decade ago. There's too much coaching in football. Real men don't need coaching. It should all be spontaneous is the idea. But Ferguson is, no, I'm going to study to be a coach.
And he's doing this while he's playing.
Well, yeah, I mean, he's playing for Dunfermline, so it's not exactly sort of top-end stuff. So he does have time. But he then gets to Rangers. Rangers make the mistake.
Yeah, that's big time.
Yeah. I mean, they get it wrong, but they do sign him as a player in 1967.
He's the Scottish transfer record at the time of £60,000.
Yeah. He becomes the Rangers number 9. But it soon turns out he's not good enough. They don't like him. And the main focus of Rangers is not footballing excellence, but religious bigotry aimed at the neighbours Celtic. So Rangers are in those days, very bigoted Protestant-only club.
Playing for his dream club, his boyhood club, is just not what he thinks it's going to be. So we've mentioned Kathy already in this episode, his wife. She is brought up as a Catholic. Fergie has this kind of mixed heritage, but he self-identifies as a Protestant. So playing for Rangers, supporting the Rangers is very normal for him.
Although he doesn't like religious bigotry.
Sure. And he doesn't partake in religious bigotry, which is why his time at Rangers becomes so complicated for him. I think he has a pretty decent first season, but at the end of that first season, he has a conversation with one of the club's directors who asks him about Kathy and how they got married. And he asks him, did you guys get married in a chapel?
A Catholic chapel.
And Fergie is kind of annoyed and very angry at the question. He answers, actually, we got married in a civil
registry office. Yeah, it was a civil wedding.
Ceremony.
Yeah.
There was nothing Catholic about it. But he later admits that he shouldn't have answered in a civilized way and he probably should have punched this guy in the face, which is his usual response to being annoyed at certain times.
Methodology.
But I think it sours the entire relationship because Fergie then, in his own words, says that everything that he does at Rangers in that second season is seen through this prism of him having a Catholic wife and not really being a real Protestant. And this culminates in this incredible game, which is Rangers Celtic, the domestic cup final, where Ferguson has a terrible game and Celtic thump Rangers. There's a picture of one of the goals going in and Fergie with number 9 on his back actually has his face in his hands because he probably wasn't tracking his man at a corner and didn't catch a header. He then says that from that moment on, he thinks he's scapegoated. He's ostracised. He's forced to train with the reserves, which is a classic thing to do with a player when you want him out of the club.
I think at one point they sent him with a third team on this long trip to play in England.
And Ferguson, in his own words, thinks this is all because of religion. I think we probably have to say it might also be to do with something as to do with talent, but the way that he will tell this story is this is very much about religious bigotry. He then turns on Rangers in an incredible way, as we'll speak about, and then spends his life actually perhaps being an anti-Rangers figure in Scottish football.
Yeah, anti-Rangers and Celtic.
Yes.
And it's a very scarring experience for him, that time at Rangers, the club he supported as a boy, because of the bigotry, because he's not valued as a player. But it does give him an idea of what a big club looks like from the inside and how not to run a club, but also how important the values of the club are. So he feels Rangers have bad values, this bigotry, but it's a very clear institution. It sort of stands for something he doesn't like.
But as we mentioned, Fergie does get a couple of international caps, so he's not all bad. Who does he end up squaring up against in the big bad wide world out there?
Well, he has this one overseas tour with Scotland. It's 1967. They bring him along and he plays 4 matches, including 3 against Australia.
This sounds like a test match more than an international.
Yeah, it's a very
competitive-
bizarre setup. They also visit Israel just in time to see the start of the 6-day war. So Israel is even more violent than Glasgow.
I think they're scheduled to play at least 2 matches against Israel. Fergie actually breaks an Israeli player's nose in the first match, so he's matching violence with violence, I think. And then the second match is cancelled because of the outbreak of the 6-day war.
It's a very bizarre series of experiences, and in those days it wasn't really considered full international matches. It was just Scots going on a summer jolly. But in 2021, some statistician in the Scottish Football Association says, no, they were real internationals. So legally, we must now refer to Ferguson as a Scottish international forward.
Capped 4 times. So Ferguson's playing career is petering out. He's not talented enough as a striker to make it at the top of Scottish football, and as he finds out very painfully, he's not sectarian enough or bigoted enough to make it at his boyhood club, Rangers. But he's already started taking his coaching badges. He wants to become a coach, this exotic European style of football management, which Ferguson wants to get in on. Join us after the break, where we will discuss how Ferguson shapes a managerial identity which will come to define and dominate English football for 3 decades. Are you loving listening to Heroes and Humans every week? Do you hate the wait between our weekly episodes? If so, why not join our official H&H Supporters Club on Patreon? This exclusive community is the place for behind-the-scenes sneak peeks, Q&A opportunities with me and Simon, and more bonus content. The link is in the episode description and on all our social media bios.
This is a reminder that you're listening to Heroes and Humans of Football with me, Simon Cooper.
And me, Mehreen Khan. Welcome back to Heroes and Humans. You join us as we're discussing how Alex Ferguson is making the transition from slightly mediocre footballer to what will become the GOAT British manager. Simon, how does he do it?
Even in his later years as a player, he's working out what kind of manager he wants to be. And he has this eureka moment when West Germany comes to train in Scotland. They're training at Kilmarnock. 1969. Ferguson obviously goes along to watch because he's a learner. He sees these Germans, they train ball possession, they train without keepers, they don't do any long distance running, completely different from what he knows from Scottish football. And he thinks they're right. And so right from the start of his managerial career, he decides he's going to train in what are called boxes. So you play 4 against 2, that kind of thing in small spaces. And really he's prefiguring what at Barcelona will be called the rondo. These kind of piggy in the middle style exercises that Johan Cruyff will make the norm at Barcelona and that Pep Guardiola will then later take on.
Are not everywhere in football
become
today.
the norm in football. Ferguson is ahead of them. This is the late 60s. And he will use these boxes until his last training session at Manchester United on May 18th, 2013. And he writes in Leading, that book he wrote with Michael Moritz, watching that practice for 90 minutes in Kilmarnock back in 1969 furnished me with a lesson that I used for half a century.
The lesson being tight spaces, first touch,
Passing,
movement,
moving into space, anticipation. The next pass.
Exactly.
Yeah, football is geometry. Football is a game about space, and the team that passes best will win. All this in British football in 1969. Nobody else believes this.
Completely alien.
He's 32, it's 1974, and he gets a job as a manager. He is appointed part-time manager of East Stirlingshire, also known as the Shire. To give you a sense of how small this club is, it's the 2nd biggest club in Falkirk.
Right.
His salary as manager is £5 a week. Ferguson loves telling the story of how he starts there. And he says, well, the chairman says to him, well, we only have 8 players. Ferguson says in his own telling, you know, it's important to start the game with 11 players.
At least you can end with 8, but you've got to start with 11.
And so the chairman says, oh, right, okay, well, here's £2,000 with which you can sign 5 more players.
So there's a guy who went from his own transfer fee being 60k to then having 2k to buy half his squad or half his first team.
Yeah, I mean, there are different versions of
There are
this
levels.
story. He may not have told this with full accuracy, but this is Ferguson's.
But he's starting at what he would consider to be one of the bottom rungs of
well, it's about the lowest rung of what you could begin to call professional football. But remember, he is Alex Ferguson. So he has this player, Bobby McCulley, who in later years will famously recall his first impression of Ferguson, and I'm not going to do the Scottish accent. You're not going to do the Scottish accent. Naraki is going to tell us what Bobby Cully said about Ferguson.
I've never been afraid of anyone before, but Ferguson was a frightening bastard from the start.
Facts.
It's better with a woman's voice,
Yeah,
right?
it is. It is.
So his first away match at East Stirlingshire, they go to Albion Rovers, and there's a hill like a village pitch, and they're hammered. They lose 5-2.
Oh, so you meant they were all drunk, so that's why they lost 5-2.
That may also be the case. I mean, they are, what would you say, battered by Albion Rovers. And for Ferguson, this is a big shock. It's not what he'd expected. You know, it's not the dream start of his managerial career. He decides, look, I have this winning mentality. I expect to be a winner all the time. But my players don't. They're just layabouts, most of them. He decides there and then he's going to get rid of players who don't want it or players he can't control. He resolves, I'm always going to work with players I can control and who I don't need to change very much. So I'm just going to take in players who already have a kind of Ferguson mentality. He wants to see himself in his teams.
And often we'll find out a lot of those players are younger because they're just easier to mould and shape in your image. And from these very humble beginnings at the Shire, Fergie finds out the things that he's good at as a manager beyond just firing people. He can do this.
Yeah, and he realised that I can make decisions and I can communicate. So when he leaves a player out of the team, he'll call a player in one by one to explain to each player why he hasn't picked them. And he also has this very strong negative motivation, which is, I'm not going to fail here. So he is massively driven in this. Obviously, he must have seemed like a lunatic because this is, second division of Scottish football or whatever.
Is he manifesting? I will not lose.
Yeah.
It's a mantra.
I will not fail here.
Yeah.
And everyone else is like, this is not even my real job. Within 3 months, he gets a promotion. He's approached by St Mirren. And so he goes to his mentor and hero, the great Scottish manager, Jock Stein. Ferguson called him Mr. Stein, former coal miner. He says, what do I do? I've just started at East Stirlingshire, but St Mirren are in for me. And I am going to render Jock Stein's advice.
Go and sit in the stand at St Mirren, and sit in the stand at East Stirlingshire, and you will have your answer.
That's deep.
It's very deep. And what Stein means is if you sit in the stands at both those clubs, you'll see which is intrinsically the bigger club. You'll see that St Mirren is always going to be a bigger club than East Stirlingshire. And so you should not hang around with the little club because it can't really go anywhere. And this will be an idea that Ferguson will use for the rest of his managerial career. Later, he sees Aberdeen will always be bigger than St Mirren. Manchester United will always be bigger than Aberdeen. No matter how low the club falls, intrinsically, it's just a bigger club and that's where you should be.
And he makes Manchester United the biggest, so there's actually nowhere to go.
Yes, he never thinks of moving up after that, but he takes over United when it's very much not a good club, but it is a big club.
So we're saying this is like actually a fake thing. So loyalty is something that is associated with him a lot because weirdly enough, he is basically seen as a one club manager. And I remember him talking about Pep and saying how much he admired Pep, but he really just thought Pep made a huge mistake by not staying at Barcelona for his entire career. He just couldn't understand it. But that's not because Fergie's loyal, because Fergie is about bigness.
Well, I think he's both, because once he is at a place of excellence, which is another belief he holds very deeply, that daily pursuit of excellence, you then have to create this place which has its own sense of values, so what we believe in this place, and its own sense of community, and its own enemies, so lasting enemies. So at Manchester United, the enemies will be the media, Liverpool, everyone. Once you're there in the right place, you then build loyalty. And even at East Stirlingshire, he's trying to build all that. But after 3 months, he thinks, he also has this enormous personal drive. So much so that when he starts at St Mirren, he's also simultaneously managing 2 pubs. And in 4 years at St Mirren, he gets rid of almost all the players. He builds a network of local people who will scout for him, which becomes a trademark, building a scouting system. He gets his not very good players practicing passing at every training session, and they become First Division Scottish champions.
Is that the league or is that the promotion?
First Division in Scotland, and this is rather complex, so pause here for a moment, is actually the Second Division.
As the Championship used to be called the First Division as well.
You're smart.
I'm old. He's also doing other things beyond, and one of them, which I find fascinating, is that he's actually perfecting I guess, one of the main identifiers of his managerial style, which is the hairdryer treatment. And so my assumption of the hairdryer was that when Fergie loses his mind, he's just like, he's bloviating, he's going off at people. But actually there is a method to this madness.
It's very
This is something
calculated.
that is completely contrived.
Well, it does express his personality. He is an extremely angry man, but he learns to mold his anger into a tactical weapon that he only uses in certain situations. It's like if you're a state with nuclear weapons. You don't use the nuclear weapons every day when you get a bit shirty with somebody. You keep them for special occasions and you use them for maximum tactical effect.
And hairdryer obviously being a reference to the fact that when Fergie's screaming in his players' faces, he does it with such ferocity that their hair...
The breath dries your hair.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And this is practiced so much so that an early colleague remembers him practicing hairdryer abuse against a friend behind the stand. So they'd get behind the stand and Fergie would be in the guy's face screaming.
Okay.
At the end, Fergie would ask, was that okay?
What will we say? 8 out of 10? Shall I tone it down a little bit? Less swearing, more swearing?
But the temper is also real. So at one point he finds the players have been drinking in a local pub. Now his anger may be slightly hypocritical given that Fergie ran 2 pubs, but he gets them all into the changing room. He smashes a bottle of Coke above their heads on the changing room wall. He says, you're going to have to stay at Love Street, which is a somewhat ironically named St Mirren ground, all night training. Quote, unless you sign an agreement never to enter the Waterloo pub again. If you're a budding manager listening to this podcast looking for tips, don't try this one at work tomorrow.
But he spent his own 20s getting completely blotto because that's just what people did.
Well, no, I wouldn't say that. I think he would occasionally get blotto and then get up at 6 the next morning and shout at people.
But do you think the fact that he's grown up and worked in pubs, he knows that that's not environment where anyone who's vaguely athletic or professional needs to be? Is that the thing?
Well, he's deeply steeped in pub culture. I mean, he knows it very deeply.
Yeah.
And I see him as a sort of 19th century Scottish temperance crusader. So the temperance movement, which is about not drinking or barely drinking, was, by some estimates, the biggest popular movement in Victorian Britain.
That makes sense.
And, because a lot of working men
Victorian
are
moralism.
getting drunk, drinking the family wages every Friday night. It becomes this very powerful working class led movement. It only starts to fade when the Americans actually do what the temperance campaigners are calling for, and they ban alcohol. Prohibition, and it's a massive failure. So after that, British temperance runs out of steam a bit.
But you're saying that temperance is led by working class men who often are probably reformed alcoholics?
Yeah, reformed alcoholics, or they had seen alcohol very close up. I don't think Ferguson was ever an alcoholic, but he lived in this world of alcohol. He quite liked alcohol, and to this day he remains keen on whiskey
and wine.
But he's very aware of the damage that alcohol does to a lot of people he grew up with in Govan as well, who became alcoholics.
Shall we talk about your favourite subject now? Masturbation?
You've got British Christianity in the sort of 19th century, which is very focused on these...
Anglicanism.
And not just the Anglicans, I think
Really?
also the Methodists, they really don't like drinking.
Yeah, but the Catholics were definitely not drinking.
Catholicism, the drinking is somewhat inbuilt in the ritual, but you still have these crusades, which I agree are probably more Protestant and Anglican, low Anglican led, against these twin evils. And one is drinking and the other is masturbation. Now, we don't know Ferguson's views on masturbation, but
we can guess.
We do know that unusually for someone who owned pubs, ran pubs, kept a bottle of claret in his Old Trafford office to share with approved visiting managers, is an obsessive wine bore. He's also a temperance crusader.
Of course he is.
And he feels, look, I have to run this whole bloody thing. So I'm not just responsible for the team on the field, I have to run their lives as well. Because at these small Scottish clubs, he's a total manager. He does everything because there's literally no other paid staff most of the time. So St Mirren, nobody in the town they play in, Paisley, really cares about St Mirren. All the men go off on the bus every Saturday to watch Rangers or Celtic. He's running this club that even the locals don't really care about. So they have to devise these marketing techniques, which he then has to run because, he runs everything. There's this electrician guy called Freddie Douglas who says, let's go around town in a van and market to potential supporters through a loudspeaker. And
that's like what people do at election time when they get the cars out and stuff about Labour.
Yeah, it's like an election bus.
Mirren.
Yeah. Ferguson didn't like shouting at the townspeople through a megaphone, so Freddie Douglas did most of the shouting, but Ferguson would stand in the van waving at people. Here's the St Mirren manager, Why don't you come along and watch on Saturday?
Does it work, Simon?
Well, the time at St Mirren has successes, but it does not end well, because in 1978, St Mirren become the only club ever to sack Alex Ferguson. There's an enormous dispute. The clubs say they sack him for lots of breaches of contracts, including unauthorised payments to players. But somewhat foolishly, he then sort of counter-sues. It all goes to court. And St Mirren say, well, you intimidated the office secretary, because he was trying to get players to get some of their expenses tax-free, which of course is illegal. Ferguson didn't speak to the office secretary for 6 weeks. He confiscated her keys and communicated with her only through a 17-year-old assistant. And the tribunal concluded that Ferguson was, quote, particularly petty and, quote, immature. Willie Todd, who was a St Mirren chairman, claims during the tribunal that Ferguson had, quote, no managerial ability.
Ouch, that's I guess he's gonna live to regret that one.
Yeah, I don't think the estimate proved entirely accurate, yeah.
But it is the first and only time that Ferguson gets sacked, and that's because he realises that I need to learn something from this. As egregious as his behaviour is towards his secretary and people around the club, the thing that he thinks that he stepped up on was the fact that he didn't bring Todd on side. So he didn't get the chairman as part of his sort of natural allies and defenders at the club.
Yeah, he thought, Todd, this chairman is just a moron, so I'll ignore him.
And then he learns that actually when you've got a chairman, you need to be nice to him, flatter him, make sure that he's never going to be in a position where he needs to fire you for egregious HR practices.
Yeah, I think this St Mirren thing becomes a trauma. It's not just the chairman you have to get on board, he decides. You have to have all the forces inside your club on board. And of course, at St Mirren, there aren't many because nobody cares about the club. But at United, he will spend hours every day keeping the board, the chairman, the players, the fans, very important at United, and the sponsors on side. He wants everyone always behind him, and he'll be on the phone all day trying to sense if there are any countercurrents. The fight with St Mirren was partly because Aberdeen had tapped up Ferguson, said, come to us, we're a bigger club than St Mirren, and they didn't want to pay St Mirren any compensation. So that caused a lot of anger. He has this chance to go to Aberdeen, which in Scottish football at the time is not quite the big time, but it's a lot more big time than St Mirren. So he's finally in a position to sell the pubs. And in 78, he goes to Aberdeen, which is a city that's just then getting rich on North Sea oil. Money was everywhere in this small town for the first time. It is
industry which is going to bankroll the British state for the next 20 or so years. It's the most booming, thriving part of the UK economy, all happening under Thatcher, of course.
Yes, just soon after he takes over at Aberdeen, Thatcher takes over the UK. He will not be happy with that, but he is in the most prospering part, almost sort of the Texas or the Saudi Arabia of the UK, albeit freezing cold.
This is gold rush territory.
He thinks, well, we're going to knock the old firm, i.e. Rangers and Celtic, off their perch. You know, he has massive anger at Rangers and, you know, he carries around massive anger anyway, and it's now directed at the old firm. We're going to show everyone how Scottish football is rigged in favour of the old firm. And so every pre-match talk is about, we'll show those Glaswegians.
Right, so he's turned on his boyhood club, right?
Yeah, very much so.
And where have we heard that before?
Well,
it's giving me Mourinho Barcelona vibes. He basically makes Rangers the villains of his life and he's getting revenge. And Aberdeen is the way that he does that. He motivates them and he uses Rangers, you know, as the kind of, as target practice.
Yeah, Mourinho and Barcelona are not his boyhood club, but it's his first big club in football, just as Rangers are Ferguson's first big club. For both of them, they feel in the end rejected.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then they go on to define so much of their lives against.
Good analogy, Mehreen.
Thank you. But I also, you know what, I just love it when people just switch up on their OG loves and then they become like the start of the villain arc. I think it's fantastic.
So at Aberdeen, he knows everyone inside the club. Not many people, but for example, there are old age pensioners who clean the stadium and he knows their names, he knows everything about them, and he's really proud that the stadium is very clean. He checks up on it. He loves the club and he gets on really well with the chairman, Dick Donald, who's a skilled ballroom dancer, a very amiable bloke, and Donald will sometimes literally waltz into the changing room.
Sorry, that mental image is so funny.
At this stage in life, he can't yet delegate. He tries to do everything himself. And one day, his assistant and mate, Archie Knox, has a strop and he gets really angry with him. and he starts shouting at Ferguson, and I've got narrakeets to replicate what Archie Knox told him.
I don't know why you brought me here. I'm the fucking assistant manager, and you still do all the training sessions. It's ridiculous.
It's ridiculous.
And there's this ancient assistant coach, Teddy Scott, who's sitting with them, and he says, yeah, Archie's right. He says to Ferguson, you should not be screaming at and coaching players all training. Scott says, you should be observing. You should be in control. And the word control, when Ferguson hears it, he thinks, yes,
Yeah.
ding, control
Money
is my
moment.
favorite word.
Yes.
I want control. He thinks, right, I'll get control by letting Archie Knox train the team, do the training sessions, and I will be the ultimate boss. I will be the kind of Joe Stalin of this club. And you don't see Stalin going out, onto the muddy fields shouting at people. Starling's in the office.
Put the cones out. Yeah.
Yeah.
But I thought about this, and I think this is a big Fergie learning, because I think Manchester United under Fergie are the only team that I, as a non-fan, can name the assistant managers of, because they're just so prominent in the identity of the team. So Carlos Queiroz comes to mind, Steve McLaren, of course, and then Mike Phelan are the ones that I can think of. Partly this might be to do with the fact that he always used to sometimes push these guys out to do his press conferences as well.
When he was boycotting the BBC.
Yeah, he didn't speak to Match of the Day or the BBC for years and years and years, and Queiroz had to do it. So he effectively looked like the day-to-day face of the team if you only watch the BBC. But I think it's important how much of a stature assistants are given in Fergie world.
Also because he knew that tactics were important, but he didn't see that particularly as his department. He didn't see himself as a master tactician the way Pep is a master tactician.
And he has he sort of swallows his ego enough that he allows these guys to shine as well.
Yeah, and it works. And what he also does is he creates this culture of zero tolerance for mediocrity and shirking in the club. So everyone's terrified of him. He hates losing. He just cannot bear anything short of 100%. After one bad defeat, he's so angry, he makes the players run through the town centre so that the punters, says Ferguson, could all give them stick. It's a kind of punishment.
Public humiliation.
And their nickname for him is Furious, which is, in a Scottish accent, an alliteration of Ferguson. They sort of love him, and sometimes they want to win for him even more than they want to win for themselves. So they're a really hard-ass team. Very few of them have any teeth. I mean, combined, the whole team has maybe 6 teeth. So Aberdeen are hyper fit. They're brilliant. They win 10 trophies in 8 years, and they beat Real Madrid in the European Cup Winners' Cup final. And when Aberdeen score the winner, Ferguson, the crowning moment of his career to that point, he tries to run onto the pitch, but he falls into a puddle and the whole bench is running onto the it's sort of like one of those World War I scenes. The whole bench is running onto the field. Ferguson goes down in this puddle and his assistant Knox tramples him, maybe accidentally, and Knox gets to the players first. After the game, obviously there's an internal ruckus within the Aberdeen team and he gets into a fight with his own forward, Mark McGee. McGee takes a swing at Ferguson. Later, very weirdly, the next day, Ferguson apologises to McGee.
Ooh.
I think an unprecedented event. Yeah.
So obviously they have an incredible triumph, which ends up in a punch-up, because how else is it going to end?
Perfect, yeah. What more would you want if you're Ferguson? Yeah.
There's the other story about them winning the cup, which they win 1-0 against Rangers, and Fergie does this incredible post-match interview where,
he's berating his players. He's really angry.
He was like, I'm pissed off. We had a terrible game. We don't deserve to win that. I'm so annoyed about how we played. I'm not taking any joy in this. And again, maybe a bit like the McGee episode, later on he says that he does regret.
Yes, but that post-match interview is what alerts Manchester United to this guy is a winner.
Yeah. He's a madman.
They said he's won the FA Cup final and he's still really angry.
Ron Atkinson would have won the FA Cup final and dined off it for years. But
decades. Jock Stein is still Ferguson's mentor. Stein says, come and be assistant manager of the Scottish national team. Ferguson doesn't really care about the Scottish national team, but he just wants to be close to Stein, learn from Stein, study him up close. And he sees, Stein has this amazing network of informants. It's like he runs his own secret police. So Stein knows when his players are out drinking or when another club is trying to sign an interesting player. He knows the personal habits of the journalists, which can sometimes come in useful. Ferguson is drinking all this in. But then comes this awful moment, which will also be life-defining for Ferguson. It's 1985. Scotland are playing Wales to qualify for the World Cup '86. So it's a big game. Stein and Ferguson are sitting side by side on the bench. And Ferguson says in the second half, he notices Stein has begun to sweat and his face is grey. He's not looking good. And Scotland at that point are losing. So they're going to be eliminated for the World Cup, it seems. Stein keeps saying to Ferguson, look, if we lose, we must keep our dignity. You know, it's going to be a really tough moment and we've got to get through this like men, he would have said. We'll go to the centre circle. We're going to thank the fans. And he keeps saying this to Ferguson. And he seems stuck on this point and he'll never say anything again. Because minutes before the end of the match, which actually Scotland, I think, go on to draw and they qualify for the World Cup. But minutes before the end, Stein rises from the bench. He stumbles. Ferguson, you know, his acolyte, grabs for him. Stein is carried off inside the stadium where he dies of a heart attack.
Wow.
So he dies on the bench. He's only 62. And it falls to Ferguson to call Stein's family to break the news. And I think it's the next day when Ferguson is driving home from Wales. He breaks down in his car and he cries. The scene always stays with him, especially once he is sort of Stein's age, in his 60s, and he's still managing Manchester United. And he thinks, my managerial career could end up in a coffin. That's not what he wants. That's a sort of trauma.
Does this incredibly, chastening and painful moment of watching your mentor die at the age of 62, does it leave him with a sense of how he needs to preserve his own longevity, things that he needs to do to make sure that he doesn't die at the age of 62? I'm just thinking about him physically. I don't think Ferguson has ever been overweight in his life.
No, I mean, he is always drunk, not very much, but he never cut out alcohol. He really likes it. But at this point, when Stein dies, Ferguson is 43. He's a workaholic. He's sleeping, 4 or 6 hours a night, always on the go. He doesn't think I'm about to die, although many Scottish men of his generation would have died in their 40s. But I think Stein's death comes to haunt him more as he gets older, because in his 60s, he's unsackable at Manchester United. He could go on forever. But at the back of his mind is always, I don't want to go out in a coffin like Mr. Stein. This is something that will push him into constantly saying that he's going to retire because he doesn't want to go out like Stein. This moment will mark his later years as a manager in particular.
And as we'll talk about in the second episode, in his late 70s, after he has retired, he has an incredible flirtation with death, which he survives.
Yes.
Simon, we all know how this particular moment of his life ends or starts, and that is his move to Manchester United. We've just mentioned that there was that cup final moment, which brings him onto the radar of Manchester United. But how does he actually end up at one of England's most storied clubs, which at that point is basically down on its knees and Liverpool are a dominant team? How did they discover this Scottish guy at Aberdeen?
Well, in the 80s, Scottish football is still taken sufficiently seriously that winning stuff at Aberdeen does get you noticed.
Right, it's on TV and stuff. You can see it.
Yeah,
Watch
I mean,
regular
I remember
games.
as a kid in those days, I was very aware of, Aberdeen, Rangers and Celtic, what
Me
they were up
too.
to. Scotland had excellent players like Kenny Dalglish and Alan Hansen. They were a proper team, which is now very hard to imagine for somebody of your generation.
Well, it's now considered to be a bit of a backwater in European leagues and also in the British context. So.
Backwater is flattering, but yeah. But anyway, so he's a massive winner in a serious league, and Manchester United are in a really bad place. Ron Atkinson is the manager, but he doesn't really do very much. And Martin Edwards, who's the United chairman, was really impressed by Ferguson's temper tantrum after winning the Scottish FA Cup final, where Ferguson is really unhappy because his players hadn't played well enough. Edwards thinks, wow, this is a guy who sets the highest standards. And Manchester United in 1986 are totally not setting the highest standards. They're a bit of a layabout club, as we'll see. Ferguson is getting a bit restless in the afternoons at Aberdeen. He goes around the club, there's not much going on, and he feels, I'm ready for something bigger than this. Edwards and the Man United delegation come to see him. I think this is not totally according to the rules of football in those days. So they meet for secrecy at a motorway service station in Hamilton. There should be a blue plaque there now. I think we should actually...
We should do
make
a
it happen.
pilgrimage, yeah.
Heroes and Humans campaign for a blue plaque at the motorway service station in Hamilton. He leads them. He says, follow my car. So it's like a very low-rent mafia movie. And they all drive to his sister-in-law's house in Bishop Briggs, where there should be another blue plaque for the talks that will end up bringing him to Manchester United. Aberdeen are a much better team in 1986 than Manchester United, but he understands United are a bigger club and you must always go to the biggest club. That's what Jock Stein had told him.
But there is another club that are in for him, and another incredible counterfactual.
Yeah,
Sir Alex
Wolves.
Ferguson could have been the greatest Wolves manager of all time.
Yes, except that he sees, Wolves are doing really well, but he sees, Wolves are a middling club who are overachieving at this point. It's not going to be easy to sustain. Whereas Manchester United, this is still within generational memory of the 1958 Munich air crash. United are a massive club that is underachieving. So I'm going to go for the potential, the massive club. This is
The upside.
very well told in Patrick Barclay's excellent biography of Ferguson. He thinks, well, I win everything with Aberdeen. I'm a winner, and I'm going to win the league with Manchester United, which is not obvious because at this point, United have not won the league since 1967. And Ferguson thinks, obviously, with me there, we're going to do it.
But winning the league is not that easy. He will not win a league in his first 6 years as United manager. And they're considered to be basically still perennially underachieving for his first stint at the club.
Yeah, it's a time of failure still at Manchester United. He comes down to Manchester without his wife and his twin teenage sons who are finishing their school in Scotland. So he lives with his trusty assistant, Archie Knox. And Ferguson doesn't think, oh, I'm, a hired hand. Oh, this is another step. Every club, he thinks, I'm going to own this club. I'm going to be in every nook and cranny of this club. I'm going to understand this club 100%. So he thinks, I'm at United. I don't have any relationship with United, which is weird now to think because we see him as the embodiment of Manchester United. But he's arrived from this completely different Scottish tradition. And he thinks, what is United about? Because I have to express and embody that every day. And so he goes around, he interviews the long-serving staff about United history. He listens to the fans. He remembers the names of the people who work in the office. He remembers the names of the players' parents. He has a fabulous memory, which has always been a strength that he uses. He speaks to everyone. He speaks to Bobby Charlton and Matt Busby, who are still very much around. He also speaks to the window cleaners. And what he takes away is this club has a giant self-image, but it's now really crappy. It's a kind of delusional club.
It's living on its name, right? They're kind of living in the past. They think they have cachet. They got a nice big stadium, but there's nothing.
Yeah, well, Jim White, who's a Manchester United fan and a very good writer about Manchester United, he writes, the place was a con and it was down to Ferguson to change it. So he thinks, yeah, you're all just faking it.
Yeah.
And his first game at United, they lose at Oxford United. But even though this is a team that is losing against Oxford, Ferguson is in awe of just the sheer greatness of the idea of Manchester United, not the reality, but the idea and the potential. So sometimes he'll go up to Norman Whiteside and Brian Robson in training and he'll mutter, big place this, big place.
And when he starts breaking down kind of the root causes of its failure, a familiar enemy turns up again. It's alcohol.
Yeah. I mean, this, of course, is an obsession of his. Alcohol, both is something that he likes, but also something that he regards as an evil. And it's all over Man United. Arnold Mehreen, brilliant Dutch midfielder who played for United just before Ferguson until 85, he recalled that after training, the whole team would go to a pub for what they called lunch. But Mehreen says these were lunches where not a bread roll was ever served. It was just liquid. You have a lot of older players who really like drinking. It's led by Brian Robson, who is able to recover from drinking and perform the next day, although, of course, his body will be prematurely shot and, he will leave football too early. And Ron Atkinson, the previous manager, just let it all go because Atkinson had better things than to kind of supervise his players. He liked the glamorous life and he was always on the motorway to London. And his training sessions are a bit light and lazy. And this is so not Alex Ferguson.
There is a rule that United have, but that's that you can't drink 2 days before a game, which he is startled at because he wants no drinking at all while players are training and they're in season.
Yeah. And as you say, he's very attuned to the idea of drinking. And he says, maybe it's carried over from the working class origins of footballers. You put in a hard shift at the factory or the coal mine, so then you're allowed to relax with a few pints. And that attitude exists in the coal mine, but it also exists at these very working class football clubs, he says. And then Saturday night, end of the working week, and so you should get wrecked. And he understands this. He understands this culture deeply, but he deplores it. He's not going to tolerate it.
And it's also probably why he is successful at ultimately rooting out. Because I imagine because he deeply understands drinking culture, where it comes from, the role it plays among men. And therefore, when Fergie, who, let's be honest, is telling you by screaming in your face and threatening to basically banish you to Timbuktu, you do it. Whereas the other example, I guess, is Wenger, who does it from a more cerebral way. This guy who's basically an alien comes to British football, English football, and changes dietary habits by actually convincing them that it's good for them and better for them. So there's two kind of different sorts of archetypes of how to upskill or introduce wellness into your dressing room.
Yeah, Ferguson and Wenger in some ways are kindred souls coming from very different places.
Very different approaches.
But I mean, Ferguson also recognizes, so he's very attuned to each person's individual relationship with alcohol. And he recognises that Norman Whiteside, who's a brilliantly gifted footballer who played in the World Cup for Northern Ireland, I think it's 16, 17, that Whiteside is not going to kick the habit. And Whiteside with Paul McGrath and Brian Robson, they lead the drinking gang. And he just has to get rid of Whiteside. Whiteside cannot be reformed. But he sells Whiteside to Everton, but he tells Everton, oh, Whiteside has this massive wage, which you need to take over. And he tells them a figure that's much higher than Whiteside's actual wage. So Whiteside is sort of quite happy about it. He gets a pay rise by leaving. And Ferguson often uses this trick to take care of ex-players. So when Keith Gillespie has moved on to Newcastle are told this massive salary by Ferguson, and Gillespie gets a pay rise. So the team isn't fit. And Ferguson thinks, right, these people are not serious. And he is serious. That defines him. And the first time he loses his temper in the changing room is soon after taking charge. They lose at Wimbledon. He goes nuts. And he starts throwing things around the changing room. And he throws this jockstrap, which lands on a player's head.
You're going to have to explain what jockstrap is, because we do have female listeners.
Right. A jockstrap, I think, might be a somewhat 1980s piece of equipment. It's very useful in cricket when you bat, because you put the box in the jockstrap.
Oh, right. It's the same thing.
Yeah.
Okay. It just protects your gonads from fast.
Yeah, but footballers don't wear boxers, obviously. But I think many players feel happy wearing a jockstrap rather than underpants when they play. The jockstrap doesn't have anything behind, typically.
Oh, so your cheeks are out.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Well, that's certainly the basis of a cricket
right.
jockstrap. So there is a jockstrap, and he's throwing and kicking things, and the jockstrap thrown by him lands on a player's head, sits on the player's head like a pigeon. The player doesn't dare move. Unnamed player. This is a brilliant story by Jim White. The player doesn't dare move, so the jockstrap remains in place while Ferguson gives the whole team the hairdryer treatment, screaming and screaming at them. But really, he's looking for Peter Barnes. Peter Barnes, a winger, not much remembered today, has been substituted after a terrible performance, and Ferguson wants to tell Barnes that he's the worst person in the world. And he's thinking, where is Barnes? He can't see Barnes anywhere. The whole team there, but not Barnes. Eventually, he storms out of the dressing room, and as he storms out, the door from the showers open, and Peter Barnes peers cautiously into the changing room, trying to establish whether Ferguson has gone. Gordon Strachan said Barnes had been hiding in the bath for half an hour, and Ferguson knew maybe this idiot Barnes is hiding in the bath. So a couple of times Ferguson goes to look in the bath for him. When he did, Barnes would duck under the water, which by this point is freezing, hiding. The water in a 1980s footballer's bath is probably so filthy at this point that it's impossible to see a human body underneath. So Ferguson failed to spot him. So Barnes is absolutely freezing at risk of hypothermia, but he's avoided being shouted at.
But this is like the true infantilization of your players. This is what toddlers and kids do when they hide from their parents after they've done something wrong. It's incredible.
Yeah, as we'll come to in part 2, if you look at the relationship of players like Ryan Giggs and David Beckham with Ferguson, it is very much infantilization.
And it starts when they're super young.
Yeah, of a loving but tyrannical father.
Right. So, and he's loving because he has a loving side. He has a charming side. He has a hugely personable side. There is old documentary footage of Fergie walking around Carrington. He's always singing to himself. He's always whistling. He's always humming. He's cracking jokes.
Yeah, he has these 1950s musical heroes, people like Frank Sinatra.
Yeah. But these two sides of him, I guess the endearing side, or it's something quite disarming about seeing him just like humming tunes to himself.
He's very much a people person.
Yeah.
So he wouldn't be a great manager if he were just an angry lunatic. He
could be a decent manager, but maybe not a brilliant one.
I think he's a brilliant manager in part because he's a people person. He cares deeply about the people around him. He knows everything about them. I mean, he can do what George W. Bush said he did with Putin, that he looked into his eyes and he saw his soul. Ferguson looks into your eyes. He asks you about your parents, and then he sees your soul and he remembers it, and he remembers everything about you. So with a lot of these players who are not very reflective individuals, I'm sure he knows them better than they know themselves. I'm sure he knew Beckham better than Beckham knew himself.
And we'll mention in episode 2, there is one player who gets very special, nicey treatment from Sir Alex Ferguson, a certain Eric Cantona.
Yes, he can read Cantona in the way that no previous manager could. He has this genius for understanding people, and he needs to be around people. So in the afternoons, he'd get lonely alone in his office, and he'd go into the other offices at Old Trafford and bother people who are trying to work, because he just couldn't be alone. And he'd also always try and stay in touch almost daily with fan sentiment. He'd talk to fan leaders a lot, wanted to know what fans thought about every player, everything that was going on. I spoke to this one guy who was a leader of a faction of Manchester United fans, and he said he would ring Ferguson in his office, and Ferguson would often speak to him for for hours, because this guy would be telling him what the fans thought. And Ferguson thought, I have to know everything that happens here, and I have to also then go out and express what the fans are thinking. That's part of my job as manager, is to be an expression of their feelings, their identity.
And in these early years, they're not doing well in the league, and they're an underperforming team. But Ferguson is imposing some sense of governability on all aspects of a club, which was just not governed at all. And if it was governed very badly. What are the other ways that he manages to do this?
He's putting in structures of excellence. Now they have to train after lunch, whereas under Atkinson, they just train in the mornings. So they're training twice a day. They start to have to eat porridge and veg at the training ground canteen. And there was almost no youth scouting when he arrived. Manchester City were getting all the best local kids, which is against the United tradition of the Busby Babes and well before. When he arrives, United only had about 2 scouts covering the whole greater Manchester area. And Ferguson thinks, no. He finds local people like school teachers who tip him on good players. He goes and watches school games in the afternoons in these early years at United. He finds this kid, 14-year-old, called Ryan Wilson. And he goes to Ryan Wilson's cottage in Swinton and persuades little Ryan's mummy, Lynn Giggs, that Ryan should sign for United.
Because he's going to City, yeah.
Yeah.
And he's a City fan as well.
And so this is what he's doing. I mean, Ryan Giggs becomes one of the greatest players and, not one of the greatest humans in British football. But imagine that he's doing that for teenage kids time after time, when 90% of the time it doesn't pay off and the kid is never going to be a United first teamer. So he's getting control of the club. He's becoming a dictator, which is his natural being. And he sits in his office at the training ground, the cliff, watching everyone through his window. And if he sees something outside he doesn't like, he punches on the office window. The player's always expecting the window to break, but magic glass, it never breaks. And if a player hasn't given 100% in a reserve team away game, in Carlisle, Ferguson has the player in and, destroys him. And he has, like Jock Stein had, he sets up his own kind of secret police, this network of fans and informants who'll call him if a player is seen out in Manchester drinking or misbehaving.
Yeah, this is before social media.
Yeah, so he doesn't have social media, so he needs a kind of in-house secret police, like the Stasi in East Germany. Paul McGrath, who's a big drinker, he says, I could just imagine him sitting at his desk with a map of Greater Manchester, plotting our drinking routes, putting in pins wherever we'd been spotted.
And this carries on even till closer to the modern day, when Rio Ferdinand is signed with great fanfare to Manchester United. I think he's injured for the first 3 months, so he doesn't play. And Rio admits that he spent those first 3 months injured, enjoying what Manchester had to offer and Manchester's nightlife. And I think when he comes back from training, so his first proper training session after injury, Fergie says a pointed question. He says, so how are you enjoying Manchester, Rio? And Rio's like, yeah, it's okay. I've just been sitting at home, putting my feet up. And he was like, I know exactly what you've been doing. And this is where we draw a line under it. But I know and I see and I watch everything. And that's even with the, relatively modern players. So from Paul McGrath up until the superstars of Ronaldo, he'll do the same.
I know a guy who was interrogated by the East German secret police multiple times, and it was a very similar experience.
So Fergie is building structures. He's imposing rules and governance on this club. But ultimately, in these years, it's not actually bearing fruit on the pitch.
No, I mean, 3 years He's gaining a reputation for nervousness. He's always blaming other people for his mistakes. And he has this obsession, this kind of what we would now think of as a Trumpian obsession, that in England there is a pro-Liverpool FC conspiracy, and it's orchestrated. This is like a QAnon conspiracy theory. It's orchestrated by the Match of the Day editor, Brian Barwick, because Ferguson has discovered that Barwick grew up a Liverpool fan. So that explains the whole thing.
It's like when you find out the head of the referees is an Arsenal fan, and therefore everything is biased in Arsenal.
Yeah.
So.
The third anniversary of Fergie's reign, it's 1989, and a fan called Pete Molyneux unfurls this legendary banner. It's now legendary in the stadium. And the banner says, 3 years of excuses and it's still crap. Ta-ra, Fergie.
They're getting abusive phone calls at home, death threats. Kathy is facing death threats from random anonymised caller, people telling them to get lost and go back to Scotland. And, this looks and sounds like a lot of those toxic years that Wenger had to suffer right at the end of his Arsenal career. The fans want him sacked. But then there is some small ray of hope in that 1989-1990 season.
Yeah, I mean, in the standard telling, the turnaround is they go away to Nottingham Forest, FA Cup, January 1990. Forest away in those days, really difficult match. United are missing a lot of players. They haven't won 8 games in a row in the league, but they fluke it thanks to a Mark Robins goal. So they carry on in the FA Cup. And that year, 1990, they finally win something under Ferguson. They win the FA Cup.
And there is a clear modern parallel here because a certain Eric Ten Hag,
listen to our podcast about him.
Manchester United manager, incredibly divisive figure, had a terrible 2 seasons going into his third, has just won an FA Cup and it's managed to get him a stay of execution. So are we saying that there is a possibility that Eric Ten Hag could be the second coming of Alex Ferguson?
Yeah, if United are patient and they just give Ten Hag another 10 or 20 years, who knows what could happen.
And complete and total control of a club that he obviously can't manage very well. It'll happen, guys.
Well, with Ferguson, United had to keep the faith because even after beating Forest, they lose their next 2 games against Derby and Norwich. They're still not a proper league team. They're a kind of cup team who can get it up occasionally for the big occasion. But Ferguson obviously is a guy who every single day you have to be 100%. But he's still almost unsackable. Martin Edwards, the chairman, said, we were never going to sack him anyway. Because even while they're losing, he is transcended from just being a mere employee to what he's always tried to do pretty much at every club is he embodies the club's values. He's gone around and he's learned what are United's values. We attack, we favour homegrown young players, the whole world is against us, and we're more a cause than a football club. And what's the cause? It's not a religious or ethnic cause like at Rangers. It's a bit intangible, hard to explain, but he feels it's there. And he says, I am like the keeper of the temple, meaning there is this cause, but it can't really be a cause without me.
But that's because football is always sectarian in a non-religious, non-denominational sense. Being a football fan is almost by definition a sectarian exercise because you're part of something which you chose, but sometimes you feel like it chooses you. You have opponents, you have enemies, you have a sense of collective identity, you have a colour, you have a shirt, you have a badge, you have songs, you have all the trappings of being in a tribe. So in that sense, it's not that difficult to kind of muster it up because football has all of the ingredients to give you a tribal identity.
I suppose what I always find so baffling in England is I always think, well, what is this tribal identity? Because English clubs don't really have religious identities
It's
anymore.
just a secular one.
United used to have a Catholic identity, but that had long gone.
Yeah.
They don't have class identities because they're all sort of working class clubs.
It's regional, it's city-based. In Manchester and Liverpool, it's definitely city-based.
Yeah, but what's the beef between Man United and Man City? What's the beef between Arsenal and Tottenham?
But all of it is concocted in the same way that every religious side, all of it is about myths and narratives and who you choose to have an enemy. So I think football is just so ripe for this kind of sense of something bigger. It's all there. I mean, as someone I am religious, and when I look at football fans and how they behave, there's almost a direct correlation with how I see people when they think about what their faith means to them and how they act about their faith.
What do you mean?
It's just like a healthier version of a channeling of a sectarian identity. And I think humans just need it, and football's not a bad way to do it.
The identity that Ferguson has from childhood and that he takes to Manchester United is of working class solidarity. It's a very trade unionist idea. The working class must be united, in this case, the Manchester United kind of union. And obviously I should be the leader of this. We're all working class people here fighting against the baddies. and we must just be there for each other.
And when you get away from all this kind of highfalutin stuff about belonging and sense of meaning, actually what Fergie's really done is he's come into a club, he's disrupted it, he's put his finger in every single pie, he's taken over the commanding heights of Manchester United, he's made himself synonymous with the entire organisation, and that makes him hard to fire, because if you get rid of him as chairman, Martin Edwards, you have to find someone else to do all these tasks. And this guy's just taken it upon himself. So strategically, it's a very good way to put yourself above the fray.
But to do that, you have to work harder than everyone else.
Of course.
So Ferguson is putting in 70, 80-hour weeks, and that allows him to run the scouting, to run the food
doing
at
the
the
jobs of
canteen.
20 people. And so if you're chairman, that's a very efficient way to run an organisation, to have one guy doing 20 jobs.
He has become unsackable, but he also is leading a team that at the start of the 90s, after nearly 4 years, appears to be going nowhere. There is no sign that they can knock Liverpool off their fucking perch, to quote Ferguson. How is this man who seems to be headed for mediocrity at best at United, how is he going to transform himself into the most revered English football manager, probably of all history?
How do you go from being the dictator of a crap club to the dictator of one of what will become the biggest football brands around the world?
In part 2, we're going to see how Ferguson turns everything around, signs a delinquent Frenchman named Eric Cantona, unites him with the kids of the class of 92, David Beckham, Gary Neville, Paul Scholes et al., and ends up football's winningest club manager of all time. Find out how this happens in part 2 next week. Thank you for listening to Heroes and Humans of Football. For more information, go to our website at heroesandhumans.com.
And follow us at Heroes and Humans on all social platforms. Next week's episode is part 2 on Sir Alex Ferguson. Is he the greatest post-war leader Britain has ever seen? Tune in to find out. This show was developed by Immaterial and produced by One Fine Play. Matt Cheney is the series producer. Kazra Firuzia is the editor and producer. We have been your hosts, Mehreen Khan
and Simon Cooper.
And this has been Heroes and Humans of Football.